Hi, everybody. I'm Erin O'Sullivan. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Strategic Partnerships at NERSA, and I'm going to let my two fellow panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Stacy Connell, and I work with SLC Wellbeing, and it's a pleasure to be here today.
Hello, I'm Nicole Broccato. I'm the Director of the Wellbeing Assessment at Wake Forest University, and I also am very much looking forward to our time together today.
Awesome. So I've got a little peek at the agenda up there for everybody. I'm also going to show you a slide here where you can follow along with us or save these links and check them out later. I do want to give a big, huge thank you to Akuhoai for hosting us today, and for all of you for attending. Like Spencer said, having so many folks from so many associations at this point in a very crazy term come together around integrated well-being and campus partnerships is in itself something to celebrate. So thank you all for being here. Before I ultimately hand it over to Nicole and Stacy to really dive into the definition, I wanted to provide some background and context for this work. For those who have seen us presenting at conferences over the past 2 years, this will be familiar. But we do want to ground ourselves here together today and understand the process, evolution that has been a part of this work, and also to appreciate the many minds that have been invested along the way in bringing this to life. As you can see, the definition comes out of the commitment. The commitment currently has 15 signatory associations, diverse organizations coming from different areas of expertise, different knowledge bases, different touch points within the campus community, but all pursuing the same goal of health and well-being and learning together. I want to stress that because we're at different places, the definition and any resources to stem from the commitment are tools to be used. They're meant to help you in your work. It's not a mandate. If it's not helpful at this moment, put it aside for a bit. That's okay. Do what's working for you. To that end, because we're all coming from such different points, this won't play out exactly the same in all of our associations and all of the campus areas that they represent. We won't all be in step on things all the time, and that's okay. In this level of collaboration, we're all using what we have from where we are to pursue the goal of furthering integrated well-being on campus. So why? Where did this all come from? Why did we start doing this? Well, the answer is kind of little kid soccer, believe it or not. And shout out to David Arnold, because this is his metaphor. So a couple of years ago, the association started talking and noticing that, well-being had been around for a long time and been a part of our work for a long time. It was sort of starting to become the buzz on campus, the new buzzword, the new shiny thing. And that can be great because it means resources and more folks taking up the work and attention. But it also can mean it turns into the little kid soccer field, right? There's the ball and everybody runs for it. And if you've seen a little kid soccer game, they're not very productive. That ball cannot get down the field because it is surrounded by a ton of tiny little humans. And so we said, well, okay, if that could be the problem, how could we, instead of being little kid soccer, perhaps be a more professional league setup, right? Which is to say a really strategic method of play where all of the players with all of their positionality and expertise are functioning together in a strategic way to push the ball down the field towards the goal. It's a beautiful metaphor, it really is. So how do we do that? We turned to some of the experts in this work. In 2017, a group of thought leaders gathered at the University of Miami for a summit to talk about the state of well-being on campus. And from that meeting came the impetus for this inter-association commitment. Hopefully you're all very familiar with it. If you're not, it has 4 calls to action, which you can see right there on the slide. On the right-hand side, you can also see the different editions of the commitment, which really just is where more organizations were signing on, and the ensuing research summits and where those came in. The third call to action of the commitment is focused on research, which we all agreed was much needed. But because there's so much to be done, we needed to find that starting point, which is where we engaged members, because the starting point should be the point of most member need, right? And this led to the 2018 Research Summit. This event was framed by the 4 questions you see on the slide. And before we got started, we went around the table and we asked everyone, should we pause to define well-being? And everyone said no, right? Because I work with well-being all the time. This is my day-to-day. Of course, I know what this means. By the time the summit came to an end, there was a consensus that, like, okay, we really need a shared definition of well-being, especially one that's particular to the higher education space. What was effective for individuals and or individual campuses or their work in their departments wasn't translating across the room amongst the group. Everyone was coming from a just different enough understanding to make it hard to move forward and compare not just across campus, but alongside other campuses. So we took that aha moment along with all the other great input and started vetting these takeaways with a broader spectrum of the memberships. We joke that we took the show on the road because we were presenting at several national conferences. We wanted to be sure that the direction we were starting to move was truly where that need was. What did we find? Well, we found that members overwhelmingly did support, yes, let's do some research, but producing a well-being definition for higher education was overwhelmingly supported as needed and foundational to any other work happening. And I really want to stress that point. This has never and will never strive to be all things to all people. In your specific areas, in counseling, in health service, in res life, you'll always need to go deeper and get more specific answers for that work. But this is intended to be a foundation from which we can all start to work together, a shared understanding. That brought us to our 2019 Research Summit, where the plan was that for our morning agenda item, we would draft a definition of well-being, and then we'd move on to other research considerations in the afternoon. Spoiler alert, it was a lot harder than that. We had asked attendees to bring campus definitions that were working for them or their peers, to review definitions from the World Health Organization and the CDC, and after a full morning of brilliant dialogue and a lot of incredible minds, it was really clear this was going to need some additional dedicated focused work. So a really amazing subgroup of Nicole and Stacy, who you'll hear from in a minute, along with Stacy Andes and Gina Abrams, agreed to continue meeting and working and building upon what was started at that summit. When the group reached a pretty well-cooked draft, we went out again to the membership to ask for feedback. So this involved a lot of back and forth with previous summit attendees, a lot more conference presentations at the national and even some at the regional levels, but also each association taking it to some key stakeholders within their memberships and using their communication channels. The Google Doc of the definition was available online, and we had lots of great feedback from these channels and also from members who just saw it online and reached out to share and engage in dialogue. We found that many were starting to use it on their campus already, and that real world application feedback was so useful. In May 2020 then, after integrating all of that great feedback, the first official edition, I guess, was released with the knowledge that we would be updating it soon after. So feedback had showed us that the core of the definition was largely there, and members wanted to start putting it into use on their campus. So while some other supplementary material was still being finalized, we didn't want to hold back what was ready. Plus, this would allow for more feedback from those who were applying it on their campuses. That feedback, combined with the evolving realities of our world, right? COVID blowing everything up and forcing us virtual, and thankfully, a stronger and sustained emphasis on the need for social justice. Things like this helped evolve our articulation in some other areas too. So that brought us to the second edition that went live a few weeks ago, and Nicole and Stacy are going to go into more depth on. While we don't have immediate plans for another update, we certainly anticipate that there will be a need for one down the line, because this is a living document, meaning it'll evolve as our understanding does, as our collective work on campus does, and that's exciting. So in summation of all of that, I'll just say that because we know this goal of integrated well-being on campuses is a large one, this definition isn't a light switch. We won't all magically start speaking the same language and have no barriers to collaboration just because this document exists. But hopefully, as more and more folks take this up as a tool and that dialogue for feedback and learnings continue, we hope a shared understanding can be a stepping stone to systemic change. And so with that, I'll toss it over to Stacy to help us dive in.
Excellent. Thank you, Erin. All right, everybody. So can you all see a PDF on the screen? Are we feeling good? We see a PDF? Excellent. So I'm going to be serving as our Vanna White and walking you through and presenting you with the real live interassociation definition of well-being document to help you become a little bit more familiar with this as a resource and a tool. So what I want to do first is just kind of give you an overview of what we've done here. In case you aren't familiar and you haven't seen it, it's released in November or its previous version from May. So what you'll see here is we have a purpose and background that gives an overview of some of the why behind what we've done. You'll see on page 2 a simple definition that really just kind of gives you the main definition. This is kind of the main takeaway in how we define well-being as an optimal and dynamic state that allows people to achieve their full potential. Further, we have an expanded definition of well-being where you see that we have a focus on 2 interdependent types of well-being, individual and community. And we're going to be really unpacking those further today. So then on the next page, page 3, this is where we unpack individual and community well-being into components. So we have 3 interrelated components for individual well-being and 2 components for community well-being. So then on page 4, we actually provide for you guys some factors that support individual well-being. So we have definitional factors for each of the components, subjective, objective, and civic, that help to kind of paint the picture of what we're meaning in each of those spaces. Additionally, there's contributing factors that are really those skills, resources, and conditions that are necessary for one to have that aspect of well-being. And so this was something that we had developed for the May release of the definition. However, what we did not have was a similar table, which we now have here on page 5 for community well-being. And so community well-being, we show the 2 components as well. We have the 2 components that are broken down into the definitional and contributing factors for each of those. And so I wanted to show you sort of what the document is. And then lastly, we have references. We have a large number of resources that we, 1, utilized in the development of the definition that we use, and 2, also to help us develop those factors, both the definitional and contributing factors, in order for you all to see all the resources that we are using every day. And a lot of the big ones that, if you work closely in this space, that you see, we have identified and listed here. Further, I think that these serve as a resource for you and your campus as you're doing this work for well-being, that we wanted to kind of put all of this information in one place for you. What I'm going to do now is actually show you a couple of the major updates in the version of this document, just so you get a good understanding of some of the changes that Erin referenced earlier from the May, kind of sort of as our community was evolving. And so on page 2, you'll see right over here, I'm going to highlight, we see this part here where we have additionally, we acknowledge that well-being is not solely a place-based concept. And the opportunity exists now for us to consider well-being more broadly in the plurality of higher education contexts, including the online environment. And what this does is this now, our definition is inclusive of those virtual learners. And I think obviously May, sort of when we were in May and where we've gone, we know that virtual learning has become such an important part of our campus communities. But also it's an opportunity for us to acknowledge how are we supporting those students prior to the pandemic. Another piece that I wanted to show you, and I think the plurality here is also in this last sentence, you see in this manner, connectedness to the institution is an overarching sense that students take with them wherever they go. And what this is doing is that we're acknowledging that well-being is not built solely upon a perfect utopian environment, but rather there is the opportunity, it exists also in the development of a skill set that you take with you wherever you go. And so I think that was an important piece that we added in there. Additionally, as I go into individual well-being, I'm going to move on to page 3. We mentioned, Erin mentioned that we have an increased focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And within individual well-being, I want to show you where that lives so you can take that with you as a nugget from our conversation today. In our individual objective well-being, we talk about that objective well-being includes, but is not limited to, a number of things. And we've added in experience of systemic equity and diversity, an experience of liberty and freedom, of participations of all levels of society, and experiences of unfettered human rights such as freedom of speech, voting access, and justice system protection. So I wanted to call that out.
Stacey,
yes, go ahead.
Interrupt for just a second. We've had a request. Is it possible for you to zoom in at all?
Yes, I can. My apologies. Is that good, or a little? Do we need a little more? We're good there. Okay. Thank you, Nicole. So yes, so also under civic well-being, the increased emphasis in diversity, equity, inclusion lives there, and I wanted to call that out here specifically. Additionally, they reject bias and prejudicial beliefs and work within the communities that are anti-racist and established to address and overcome social injustice. So we really work to call that out within our definition. I mentioned before within community on page 5, we now have a whole table to support the work that we're doing. And then again, we added many, I'm gonna just zoom out, we added many resources that you can see on page 6. And so I just wanted to help us to become a little bit more familiar with the document, so that way it can become more usable of a tool for you in your work. So I'm going to switch back to the presentation. So just give me just a moment. I'm going to come big, and then my presentation will hopefully take over here. And we're back. So what I wanted to share, so I walked us through the document, and as I said, as to show you where we are, but I think it's important that as we review this important definition, that we recognize the capacities and limitations of the document, what it is and what it isn't. And so what it is, so this document, first, it's designed to be theoretically unifying. This layers in with the socio-ecological model of health promotion, and thoughtfully considers and incorporates supporting frameworks, including the Okanagan Charter, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Culture of Health, CAS standards for advancing health and well-being, and the ACHA standards of practice. Second, as Erin has said already, it is a living document that we can update, and as we continue to learn on this journey together in the space of well-being within higher education, and as our world continues to evolve and pivot, that's my favorite 2020 word, this definition is also nimble and will adapt with our learnings. Further, this definition is not designed to be prescriptive or a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather it gives you the space and ability to tailor it to your campus's unique needs, attributes, interests, and values. And so that's exciting. We recognize that no one person deserves a one-size-fits-all approach, and so neither do our campus communities. So what it is not, the limitations that exist within this definition. First, it still has to be operationalized by you on your campus, or by people on your campus, rather. It's not just a one man or one woman or one person show. You have to determine how you will function, how this will function on your campus. What will your goals be? How will you measure those goals? What indicators are you looking for? And where does the accountability lie for this shared responsibility? Second, it is never going to list every possible detail related to well-being, and we have to be okay with that. And I think us, as those that contributed to producing this piece, are very comfortable with where we are, but we just wanted to make that claim that we recognize that we won't be able to be all things to all people. Third, because it's customizable, you must tailor it to your campus's needs in order for it to work. And so I believe that as we begin to utilize this definition, the more we use it, the more functional it will become in our work. And again, it will also help us within this learning process together as we learn from one another on this journey. So diving in a little bit, I shared with you on page 2 of the PDF, and you see it here, The simple definition, right? This is the one, right? If you're going to take the one liner, the one thing home with you today, I would say this. And so there's a lot to unpack in here. Optimal, dynamic, full potential, which is why we have those supplementary paragraphs and tables, and why we expect that this is going to be a living, ever adjusting definition. And I want to pause here and share that there's something that we get asked a lot about the release of this definition that I wanted to share with you all, because you may be already thinking it. But what about the use of the word health or wellness? Should we only use well-being moving forward? And so health is often focused on that physical and mental health. Wellness is often described in dimensions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and tends to be focused on prevention of physical health and mental health conditions. But as you can see in this definition of well-being, well-being is connecting more deeply with life satisfaction, fulfillment, achievement, and different attributes that you don't typically see in other definitions of wellness. So with the publishing of this interassociation definition, we are completing the charge of providing clarity for well-being in higher education. But certainly there is a time and a place and a moment to utilize all three of those words, health, wellness, and well-being, within what you are doing on your campus. So that is a question that I hear a lot. And so I think now what we're providing is the opportunity for us to be intentional with how we move forward with our well-being efforts on our campus. So also on page 2, I shared with you guys the expanded definition of well-being. And I'm going to stay a little bit high level on this, so that way we can provide opportunity for Nicole to take us a little bit more deeply into our individual and community well-being pieces. But what I wanted you to see is a couple of things. First, the focus that we have here is on 2 interdependent types of well-being, with individual really coming into 3 categories. First, we're looking at that subjective individual well-being, where everyone is feeling happy, they're thinking life is good, and experiencing minimal negative emotions. The objective individual well-being are those basic human rights and needs being met. And then the civic individual well-being are community-supported values and contributions. And so there's a lot to unpack, and Nicole will take us further in there. Whereas our community well-being, I think the big take home is everyone feels good and they feel good about their communities for subjective community well-being. And an objective community well-being, and this is big food for thought for us as campuses, are that the structures make it possible for everyone to achieve their full potential. And so as we dive in, people have asked, why 2 main types? Why are there 2 main types? And so what we wanted to share with you is that it might sound like we just took, and for those that, we recognize that there are 2 main components, and they're built within the definition to encompass the entirety of this socio-ecological model. We've presented ACHA's health promotion model or socio-ecological model here, but the ideas are similar across those models. And what you can see is we didn't just layer in, we didn't just take individual out and community out from this model, but what we did is, you can see individual, we have the intrapersonal, and I realize that I'm circling the screen and no one can see my circles, so my apologies. But what you see is we have that intrapersonal is really a big part of our individual well-being, but our community well-being piece is spanning that interpersonal, institutional, community, and public policy levels that exist within the socio-ecological model. And so therefore, these 2 interrelated types, and I've kind of spoken to what they are already. We have the individual well-being, right? We've talked about this. And then we have the community well-being, but they need each other to coexist. You cannot have that individual well-being without community well-being. So I think it's important. We wanted to show that connection. And this brings to one of my favorite statements from within our document, which is that we're focusing on the whole person, the whole educational experience, the whole institution, and the whole community. And with this, well-being becomes that multifaceted goal and a shared responsibility for the entire institution. And so from here, I've shared with you a great overview, but Nicole is going to take you and help you to dig into each component of well-being.
Thank you, Stacy, for that wonderful introduction. Give me just a second here to get everything shared. Great. Like Stacy said, I'm going to be walking us through individual and community types of well-being, but I'd just like to mention here that community well-being is not my particular area of expertise, and I'd like to acknowledge that Gina Abrams, who's really our expert on all things community well-being, can't be with us today. She sends her regrets, and I am hopeful that she will in future presentations be able to provide better and richer context than I'm going to provide for us today. As we saw in Stacy's overview of the definitional document, the interassociation definition of well-being has two types of well-being, and then the types are made of components, and then the components have definitions and contributing factors. And so this begs this very obvious question, like why would we do this? This seems to be overcomplicating things to have a definition, and then we have types and components and parts of parts. But we did this in order to simplify things and in order to retain some flexibility so that the definitions weren't becoming too prescriptive. And to explain how this works, I'm going to walk us through the process using our individual well-being theory. So individual well-being theory has a literature and a history that spans back at least to 4th century BC Aristotelian ideas of eudaimonia. And for the purposes of our conversation today, the main reason that this is important is that it means that well-being theories had a lot of time to become very complicated. We've got, over the last 2,500 years or so, sort of two main camps of at least Western philosophy of well-being, subjective and objective. And then there's types within those two camps, and it continues to become increasingly complicated. So subjective theories typically ask some version of, do I, according to my own standards, feel good, think my life is good, and have minimal experiences of negative emotion? So they're theories that are subjectively evaluated about my own internal experiences. And objective theories tend to ask, do I have everything on this checklist that somebody else wrote that I need to have in order for all my daily needs to be met and to feel safe and free from discrimination and full civil liberties, et cetera. So objective theories are typically things that other people wrote and about things that we can observe from outside the person. And then there's this additional type of objective well-being theory. These are eudaimonic well-being theories. And these still have that, like somebody else wrote the checklist quality to them, but they tend to still be about internal and also values-driven experiences. So they ask things like, do I have everything on this list in order to live my best possible life? So do I feel like I have good relationships and meaning and purpose and engagement and mastery? And also they tend to have a strong component of civic engagement. So these theories seem to cover, like these three buckets of theories seem to cover all the ground. Why did we make adaptations? Well, we did it for a couple of reasons. First is that those three camps of theories say that they're incompatible with each other. You can have subjective or objective, but not both, for instance. And both in some recent social sciences research and in our lived experience, this doesn't fit with the way that we experience these types of well-being. So as an example, if I have enough money to have food and shelter and healthcare, et cetera, which is a kind of objective well-being, my stress levels are probably lower. That's a kind of subjective well-being. And then hopefully I also have enough resources and time and other capacities left over in order to do some of the things that I like to do. And that is, of course, improving my subjective well-being. And hopefully I also, hold on, I got a button problem. There we go. I also have time and resources left over to do things that I value. And I used a civic engagement kind of an example here. It doesn't have to be that, but that's a kind of eudaimonic well-being. And when I do things that I value, that increases my sense of meaning in life, which is a kind of eudaimonic well-being. And we know from research that sense of meaning in life is a kind of eudaimonic well-being that contributes strongly to subjective well-being. So, right, between research and our actual lived experiences, even though the theories say these things are all separate and incompatible, our experience is that all these things go together and are important. The other reason we adapted these theories is that without some kind of organization structure, if we just collected lists of all the things that are in the theories, we had this problem with like overwhelming lists. Like, what do you do with all these lists of things? And a side effect of having lists of things that are all equally important is that they start to sound prescriptive. And the best way to demonstrate the problem with this is through an example. So if you had told college-age Nicole that she had to have lots of activity engagement in order to have well-being, she would have had unkind things to say to you. Not only because she doesn't want to go to the games or pledge the Greek system or be president of all the clubs, she also didn't have the money or the time because she was working and trying to pay her way through college. So if we get too prescriptive and unorganized with all the things in the list are important, we end up setting impossible standards for people. To resolve all these tensions and keep all the things that we liked and felt that were important, what we did was we left subjective well-being largely alone. We left objective well-being largely alone. And then we took eudaimonic well-being and narrowed its focus largely to what we now call civic well-being, which is the extent to which I care about and value community and the extent to which I do things to instantiate those values. And then we took the components of eudaimonic well-being that both in our lived experience and our research, we know contribute to subjective well-being, like meaning and purpose and engagement and mastery and relationships, and we moved them over into the subjective well-being bucket. And then we kept all the buckets, right? We ignored this part about the buckets don't go together. But we still have this problem, right? Within each of our buckets of subjective, objective, and civic well-being, we still have these big, long, disorganized lists. So what we did in order to avoid that problem of seeming too prescriptive was we pulled in each of those buckets a few key ideas and retained those as the core definition. And then we put everything else into those lists of contributing factors that Stacy was talking about earlier. And the idea is that we treat those as flexible toolboxes. So let's see what this actually looks like for individual well-being, and then we'll do community well-being in a minute. In individual well-being, these are the very most simplified versions of those three component definitions. Subjective is the extent to which I feel good, I think my life is good, and I experience minimal negative emotions. Objective is the extent to which I feel like my human rights and basic needs are met, which is sort of another way of asking about the extent to which I feel like the community cares about me. And then civic is the extent to which I care about and engage in actions that show that I care about the community. And then we're actually going to look at the document here in order to look at our contributing factors. So just to reorient us here in the document, I'm on page 2, which is where Stacy showed us that the background and the simple definition and the expanded definition are. Move pages here. And then on page 3 are the full and rich definitions for the components of individual and for community well-being. And then on page 4, we have our definitional factors are on the left-hand side and our contributing factors on the right-hand side. So let me make this a little bit bigger here so we can see it. All right. In subjective well-being, which is again that feeling good about myself and life, in our contributing factors, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, we see right away some of those eudaimonic theory components that I was mentioning earlier, right? Meaning, purpose, mastery, all these kinds of things. We also see some contributions from positive psychology and clinical psychology up at the top. And very importantly, we see the interrelatedness of community well-being. We see that we cannot have subjective well-being without infrastructures and people and relationships in the community sphere that are making all those things possible. And this theme of you can't have individual well-being without community well-being shows up again in objective and civic well-being. So in objective well-being, it's very clearly stating you just cannot have people feeling like their basic needs and rights are met unless you're having infrastructures in place that are meeting everybody's needs and making sure everybody's rights are protected. And then in civic well-being, which again is valuing doing good for the community and engaging in behaviors that do good for the community, you need infrastructure, opportunity, and people who are helping you learn that these things are important and how to do these things and giving you opportunities to do these things, especially in college as a learner. All right, so we did that slide, A good question to ask at this point is, how does the interassociation definition of well-being fit with the kinds of multidimensional models we often see in higher education programming? And I've put a made-up example of a multidimensional model up here. I often call these context-based models because they refer to contexts in our lives, our spiritual lives, our occupational lives, et cetera. So before we get into the technicalities here, I'm just gonna say as like a point of personal promise here that these things can live together. I've been at Wake for 6 years and some change now, in a research role where we have a model and definition of well-being that look a lot like the interassociation definition, but our programming arm at Wake uses an 8-dimension model that looks an awful lot like this one. And we help them, they help us, and we collaborate and work together, and it works beautifully. So in the brief time that we have together today, what I would say is that probably the best way to start getting these things working together is to think about how you can take components from the interassociation definition and layer them into or infuse them into your context-based model. So returning to our meaning and purpose example, you could see, for instance, that maybe different people might get meaning and purpose from different areas in this model. I, for instance, might find a lot of meaning and purpose in maybe spiritual and occupational, and maybe Stacy finds it in social emotional, and maybe Erin finds it in environmental, which isn't even on our wheel here. And I don't know, I'm just making these things up to like make the point here. So you could think about, right, how, if we were going to talk with students, faculty, and staff about the ways that all of these things contribute to meaning and purpose, what might that look like? Another way to do it is to think about where in our model might we want to focus our discussions and infusion of meaning and purpose. Maybe we want it to live mostly in spiritual or spiritual and occupational, something like that. You can also think about bringing over these strong ideas about the contributions of community. These wheels, at least on their face, are very focused on individual components of well-being. They don't, at least, face validity. They aren't talking a lot about institutional contributions and responsibilities for individual well-being. So you could say, how might the institution be supportive of or contributive to physical well-being, emotional well-being, and so forth? When we think about well-being, I think most of us tend to think about well-being from the perspective of the individual. And when we think about community factors, we tend to think about them in service to individual well-being. And we are trying to make a stronger claim here in the interassociation definition that community well-being is important in and of itself. Its role in our lives is not just in service of individual well-being. And the reasons for that lie in the definition. So if we look back at this slide that Stacy showed us earlier with the interrelated definitions of well-being, we see that community well-being kind of has two key ideas in here. One of which is that everybody, all people, should be experiencing well-being, and that community well-being, even more so, is defined by the extent to which all the community infrastructures, resources, policies, practices, norms, procedures, et cetera, in place for everybody to experience well-being. And as a function of that definition, our component summaries our components in community well-being expand on those two ideas. And what you probably notice right away is that we don't have a civic well-being in here. From an individual well-being, we had civic well-being that looked something like the extent to which I care about and contribute to the community. And it's kind of circular here, right? It would look like the extent to which the community cares about and contributes to the community. So we just have subjective and objective well-being here. And subjective builds on this idea that everyone feels good and everyone feels good about the community. And it's in a very much not in a utilitarian, most of the people, most of the time kind of way, but in an everybody, no Starfleet cadet left behind kind of way. And then objective well-being, whereas an individual well-being, objective well-being was the extent to which I feel like I have my needs and rights met. Objective here is the extent to which we can actually go out and measure and see that all these infrastructures are in place. So there's a shift here in perspective relative to individual well-being. Let's take a look at our contributing factors. I'm just going to move down a page here. If we look at the contributing factors in subjective well-being, we see for community well-being, we see once again that they span the socio-ecological model. And some of them seem to be sort of more focused in one particular area of the socio-ecological model, like interpersonal relationships, draws heavily from the interpersonal level of the socio-ecological model. And others seem like they could potentially span, depending on how you interpret and apply them, span multiple levels of the socio-ecological model. So trust, for instance, could be the extent to which I as an individual have trust building skills and can build those skills then in my relationships. And it can also be the extent to which I trust the institution, feel like the institution trusts me. And we could also do some of those externally verifying. Can we see if the university, college, institution has policies, procedures, and practices in place that reflect trust in its members? Oops, too far. Here we go. Oh, it's going to be fussy now. Oh, no. Let me zoom out a little bit. So I'm sorry this is harder to read, but it's not wanting to let me just be at the bottom of the page here. In objective well-being, because objective community well-being sits so far along the socio-ecological model, a lot of the contributing factors sit a little further along the socio-ecological model, but we also see that there are still components that come from all the levels. For instance, helping relationships are a necessary part of building the infrastructures that we need in order for everybody in the community to feel cared for. Wrapping us up here, wrapping up our theory section here, if we put the component summaries for community and individual well-being together, we can really see just how tied together they are, how you can't have one without the other. And we're just going to walk right up the ladder here. So, so if I have civic well-being, I care about the community, there are enough other people who care about the community, eventually we're going to have enough people in place who can build the infrastructures that we need to make sure everybody is taken care of. And that means that people are going to feel, when they feel like their rights and needs are taken care of, and everybody feels that way, not only are people going to feel good, but we're going to have everybody feeling good, and they're going to feel good about their community. And as we talked about a few slides ago now, when people feel good and have the resources that they need, they have the energy and time and other capacities left over to do things that they care about, like participate in academics and graduate, and also contribute back to the community that has been taking care of them. So we end up with like a vicious cycle of positive well-being. So understanding that this was all sort of like drinking from a fire hose and that more conversation and discussion are needed, I am going to pass us back to Stacy now, who is going to talk about practical applications.
Wonderful. Thanks, Nicole, for really digging in with us there. So we gave you a lot of information, and recognizing that all of our attendees are coming from different places in this conversation and in the work that you do day in and day out on campus on Zoom, in all of the places that you're doing your work. We want to acknowledge that. And our goal here today, as we've said earlier, is to make this actionable. And we would like for each of you to consider, what's one takeaway? Like, this is great. There's a PDF and now I know about it, right? If you didn't know before, there's a PDF. But what can I do? What does this mean? And how can this advance well-being on our campus and our efforts towards well-being? And so I want to start by offering us the opportunity to reflect a little bit about what we've talked about and considering you and your role on your campus. So first, I want you to think a little bit and take a moment to consider, how does the work of your department and you and your role advance or detract from individual well-being for students, faculty, staff, and I know there's other groups. I know there's alumni. I know that there's incoming students, but I just want you to consider where you are with the work that you're doing in your role. Next, how do the programs and services offered on my campus mutually reinforce an aligned vision for community well-being for all community members? Are there norms within the culture of my campus that detract from perceived or actual well-being, right? There's perception and reality, and that's important for us to consider. And then, is there sufficient infrastructure and resources for my campus to be deliberate in supporting well-being? And, I think there's, in the campuses that I've had the opportunity to be a part of or observe, sometimes we have good intentions with most everything we do on campus. Most people don't go into higher education and they're like, I'm gonna say a message and I hope to offend a lot of people, right? Like, that's not our goal with any program, service, communication campaign. And so I think it's important for one to assume best intent as we have conversations, but sometimes we might claim a focus on well-being, but are we celebrating that our school is elite and therefore we have a hyper-competitive environment and no one passes first-year biology, right? Are we similarly, but maybe different? Is our institution perhaps like, you just got to tough it out those first few years, you got to just grind, and it's this idea of a shared dissonance, collective misery, rather than a space of well-being? I think additionally, there's an opportunity within the teaching and learning environments as a campus to establish conditions for well-being. Do we have established conditions within these environments that are shared by all instructors, such as, do we have deadlines for papers and assignments due at 8 a.m. or 6 a.m. or midnight, or do we say 8 p.m.? Do we create unnecessary stress in the classroom by grading with a curve, or maybe a lack of clarity in what we share on our syllabus? So I think that's something for us to consider in the teaching and learning environment. Moreover, I think as programmers, it's important for us to consider, are we creating spaces for students to learn the skills to optimize their well-being? I say students, but also I recognize that we might have folks that are focused in on the faculty and staff well-being as well, but for people to optimize those skills, to harness those skills. And I think of an example, in a previous role, I was working with auxiliary services, and university housing was a part of our umbrella. And we would talk a lot about how there was a trend with the resident, the RAs, the resident assistants, that they had a trend where the RAs would talk to one student about the problem and they talk to the other student, and the RA would solve the problem, and those two students never had to talk to each other. And so are we taking away the ability for those students to learn those life skills of having a crucial conversation with someone they're in conflict with? And so I think there's a lot for us to consider, because sometimes what we're doing on our campus might unintentionally contradict what we're trying to achieve in the space of well-being on our campus. So how does this apply to your work, right? I mean, you said, like, Stacey, you're going to talk to me about applying. So you've thought a little bit about it, but I want us to think about, what are the spaces that we're in today with well-being? I'm going to start here. We got people around the table. It looks like a committee to me, guys. I know we're not always around the table. There's way more than 6 people, or way more, whatever our gathering size is where you're at. They're not masked. There's a few things, but I think it's important for us to consider committees, right? So many campuses now have well-being committees, task force, council, whatever, action team, whatever the name is on your campus, but a lot of us have those. And so I think it's important, number one, you could just share this definition with that group. You could have a dialogue with the people on that group. You could also take it a step further and say, you know, how do we use these contributing factors and the definitional factors? How can we use this in the work that we're doing to make sure we're aligning in a way that makes sense? I think also you can look at your committee, going back to that DEI lens that we're adding to the work, and saying, who's on the committee? Are people represented? Does everybody on the committee look like me, act like me, think like me, have the same educational background? Are we all researchers? Are we all programmers? Are we really getting a good representation so that all voices are heard? And I think that representation piece transcends not only in our committees, but also when we're developing and designing and refining the current and existing programs and services that we're offering. So I shared with staff previously that I worked with this idea that as we are working on a new idea, or we're working to refine an existing one, are we making sure everyone's at the table? And it's this idea of don't do something for me without me, right? If we're going to be focusing in on an effort to increase participation or engagement of our commuter students, let's bring a commuter student into the conversation to help them co-design this process. So I think there's an opportunity for us to have harmony in this space. Second, outcomes. So looking at what we have provided with you, there's an opportunity for us to use what we've given to help support the measurement and evaluation process that you are using to gauge the effectiveness of your well-being programs, services, initiatives, and interventions that you're doing on your campus. And Nicole mentioned this earlier, another opportunity that you have is to look at the model that you're currently using for well-being on your campus and seeing how it already aligns with the definition and the supporting tables that we've provided. So these are just some simple action steps. I think just really looking at what we're doing on our campus and how can we ensure that the work that we're doing is aligning with our shared goal as an institution. And so we've got a little time now for some Q&A before we wrap up. And so we do have some questions in the chat box. And I am happy to check these out. They're not popping up for me. So maybe if one of my co-presenters wants to.
Yeah, we had a couple early on that I think we've addressed about the differences between terms in health and wellness and well-being, and what are the, like, what is this individual versus community well-being kinds of questions. We have some great conversation running through chat about resources for reading a little bit more about the extent to which health, wellness, and well-being are different terms and cover different constructs, and some very good comments, sort of, I think, that are very consistent with things we've said earlier, that there's no one magic formula for well-being, or probably health or wellness, that fits everybody. No one program does all the magical things for everybody. And so it takes tailoring and adjustment. And we've got a question here too about burnout and thinking about the causes of burnout and differentiating between the subjective and objective causes of burnout. I know there is a big literature around, and particularly in industrial and organizational psychology, around burnout. It's not my particular area of expertise, but I would say for this question about trying to determine between subjective and objective when assessing the causes, my understanding is that burnout is typically thought of as being something that's a bad fit between the person and the environment, rather than something where it's a problem in KSAs within the individual. And then in terms of things being subjective or objective, that's more about the frame of reference from where you're looking at it and trying to evaluate where the change is coming. So if anybody has some more good resources or more helpful information than what I just gave about burnout, please drop that in the chat and share with all of us. Otherwise, I think we're ready to move on and wrap up and be respectful of everybody's time.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for participating in today's webinar. We want to, again, just refer you to where the document lives in case you need it as a reference. And we appreciate your time and thank you for being with us today. And thank you, AQI, for hosting as well.